Thank you all very much. My wife's a scholar of Asian religions, India in particular, Hinduism. And on the east coast of India, at one of the four great temples that mark the four corners of India, there's an annual festival, a car festival they call it, where they haul a god and the icon of the god through the streets. And 6,000 people have to pull the god through. It's quite remarkable. When the British colonized India, they saw this spectacle, and they were appalled. It was to the Hindu god Jagannath, Lord of the universe. And devotees, once you get this massive weight rolling, they would, some in an ecstatic state, would hurl themselves under the wheels to be crushed. And the British thought, what is going on? And from that, Jagannath came the term that entered English, a juggernaut. The British dubbed their World War I line of ships, the dreadnoughts, the vast mass with inertia. And what we have, I would submit, in thinking about ecological issues is the planetary human community has been unleashing vast forces that have a remarkable inertia of their own. What can restrain such forces? I heard today on NPR as I was driving here, global economic growth is at about 5%. Well, at what point can the planet sustain, as we go from 6 billion people to 9 billion people, a 5% economic growth rate? How will we possibly restrain the burning of fossil fuel when India and China are coming online as economic superpowers, and the United States and Europe have both been very slow to curtail our fossil fuel consumption? So we have a vast inertia there. What's the role of world religions? What's the role of philosophical traditions or religious traditions of thinking? Can they help us generate a worldwide movement to push for policies of restraint and change that can save the planet? Well, I like to think of religions in terms of the history of ideas as ancient cross-generational vehicles with great inertia too, that these sets of ideas have a power that crosses generations, for good or for ill. And one of the roles in religious studies and theology can be a critical one of examining in which direction is this inertia flowing. And in some ways, I think the talk today titled The Dignity of Persons and the Value of Nature, I'd have to say the inertia in modern Protestant and Catholic and Orthodox Christian thinking is surely pushing attention towards the value and dignity of persons, but it falls rather silent about the dignity of nature. And in fact, the way a lot of ideas are constructed and doctrines are thought of in modern Protestant and Catholic ethics, the category of nature becomes used philosophically as a foil, as a sphere of undignity that marks the distinctive special dignity of the human. And so some of the attention that I'm trying to give today is the way these religious ideas have been socially and historically constructed and so our thinking about nature doesn't typically occur in the history of Christianity because, oh, they were worried about what we're doing to the Amazon. We're the first generation that is worried about what's going on in the Amazon. That's a new moral challenge. So the thinking about nature was developed out of history of ideas and in religious sensibility, often to make claims about the special character of the person or God's magnificence. And the inertia that I mentioned really suggests that the dominant inertia today that inspires and shapes the 2 billion Christians, those who self-identify loosely as Christian on the planet, 1/3 of humanity. That's quite a potent community. And if the theological inertia for the last 3 centuries has been by and large to focus attention on the category of human and our special dignity and our the human condition as framed by the category of history, that we're historical actors, and that we have unique capacities of rationality and freedom. Nature, however, given the dominant narrative that has really shaped Christian theology from the rise of early modern science, has been by and large a mechanistic one. I would suggest that it's the uncritical assumption, the uncritical acceptance of the mechanistic world picture that still infuses much of Catholic and Protestant thinking today, to its detriment, because it means that ecological issues have been very slow to get priority attention from those religious traditions. What's the dominant paradigm of modern Western ethics? Well, I like Hans Jonas's analysis. He argues that essentially modern thinking, modern ethical thinking, philosophical and religious in the West, has been by and large human-centered and present-oriented. We didn't have technologies that could do truly vast damage to generations far out. Surely you had clear cutting of southern Italian hillsides, and that could do damage. So deforestation we were aware of. But you didn't have nuclear weapons concerns that could pollute for 10,000 years into the future. So by and large, human life was so vulnerable. Our concerns were saving the present living humans amongst us. So the focus was present-oriented. And by and large, the rest of the sphere of nature seemed vast and a given, non-problematic. Why waste precious ethical capital worrying about the vastness of the Amazon when it doesn't appear to be endangered anyway? This is at a period when in Western Europe often longevity was 35 years. So the preciousness of human life, not surprisingly, got flagged, and for very good reasons. If the paradigm of modern Western ethics is by and large human-centered or anthropocentric, the emerging ecological data in the 20th century and our 21st now it's not surprising ecological sciences have been called the subversive sciences, that they're subverting a lot of modernist assumptions, and that we have a whole new range of powerful technologies, a whole new lexicon and vocabulary is coming in about ecological challenge and ecological threat. Today's New York Times has 2 or 3 stories. Tom Friedman has an editorial about the great grasslands of Kenya. We have a story on the front page today about islands in the Bangladesh Delta sinking due to increased sea levels. Now, we're getting a whole new vocabulary that's focusing our attention in different ways. So we have a new challenge. How do you take Western ethics that's by and large human-centered and grapple with this brand new set of challenges for which we've have precious thinking in the past to guide us? There's a reformist ethical response that by and large says, as soon as we understand that preserving the dignity and well-being of humans requires ecological, environmental protection, we don't really need to transform traditional human-centered ethics to generate strong claims for why we need to protect the planetary ecosystem. If the ecologists are right that human life and well-being depends upon ecological inputs and a stable climate system and healthy ecosystems, then it's in human self-interest to so stabilize those environmental conditions. So many would argue you don't really need a revolution to throw away the human-centered thinking. In fact, all you need to do is ecologically inform our understanding of human self-interest, that it's in our crass human self-interest to save the whales and the other species as well. Now, one of the kind of hottest issues in ethics in this area is, should we accept that argument or not? And many people argue that by uncritically accepting the anthropocentric tradition, we don't go far enough. That what we need is not a reformation merely ecologizing our understanding of human self-interest. That many would argue that doesn't adequately grapple. It still allows us to say animals have no intrinsic dignity, no rights, or no intrinsic value. It's just the human and human individuals that have intrinsic value and dignity. We just now know that we need to preserve plant and animal species for our own self-interest. At least the reformist model wants to expand and environmentally inform our understanding of individual and communal human self-interest. That in and of itself is a real achievement, so it's not something that we should toss away. But it rests content on the notion that the primary rationale for saving the Yellowstone, or for worrying about climate change, or for worrying about endangered species or a species going extinct is primarily that event's impact on present human interest or future or our children's generation's interest. That our children's generation will be impoverished if the last black rhino goes extinct in Africa, for example. Many would argue that still allows us to rest content in a very arrogant position of thinking that of all the living entities in the physical order of planet Earth, only the human has a monopoly on intrinsic value. That the complexity of the other primates or dolphin or the great whales or the elephants, that they are still best characterized as having a value only in their serving as instruments to human pleasure. So the revolutionary movement would want to try to throw over the anthropocentric, human-centered traditions in Western ethics and try to expand out notions of intrinsic value. In religious studies and in the whole area of popular culture and science, we've probably all heard of a famous article by Lynn White in 1967. He was a medieval historian, and he wrote an article in Science, in the journal Science, titled "The Historical Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis." It's a very interesting and provocative article. Basically, he argues that, okay, the problem of ecological degradation is the juggernaut of modern technology, and that's been allowed to occur through the juggernaut of the rise of modern science. And modern science breaks out only in Western Europe. Why is that? As a cultural historian, Lynn White argues, it's because of the Judeo-Christian heritage, primarily the culprit being Christianity with certain theological assumptions, namely that as the ancient Hebrews broke with the animist traditions of pagan, non-Hebraic cultures, that's we dub the pagans, right? That an insistence on understanding that the locus of God is in the transcendent sphere. Lynn White argues that set a chain of religious events that both the Hebraic tradition and the Christian theological tradition then functionally began to denigrate the value of the down here material world. That by retrojecting the zone of the sacred into the transcendent sphere and reserving reverence only for God and cutting out reverence being applied to the natural order. Lynn White argued that religion actually is a very powerful shaper of all cultures, and in the West, the dominant religious shaping tradition has been Christianity, and that in destroying pagan animism, I'm quoting here, Christianity, he says, made it possible to exploit nature in a mood of indifference to the feelings of natural objects. He argues that the Christian dogma of humanity's transcendence of and rightful mastery over nature is really makes Christianity the most eco-unfriendly of all the great world religions. And he suggests that Christianity bears a huge burden of guilt for the ecological crisis. He argues that both our present science and technology are so tinctured with orthodox Christian arrogance toward nature that no solution for our ecologic crisis can be expected from them alone. Since the roots of our trouble are so largely religious, the remedy must also be essentially religious, whether we call it that or not. We must rethink and refeel our nature and our understanding of our destiny. Now, the article, so in Lynn White's analysis, the Christian heritage is painted in broad strokes as fairly monolithic and from the get-go anti-ecological, from the get-go intrinsically human-centered. This triggered a huge debate, and many Christian theologians engaged White's essay with some maturity and accepted that, Lynn White has a point here. There has been a complex history here, and in too many centuries, our theology has emphasized only the dignity of the human, and we've ignored or downplayed the dignity of the rest of the created order. But they also began to feel increasingly that White's analysis was just simply historically too simplistic. An alternative historical account, one that I'll be developing in a little while more thickly, would break with Lynn White's notion. Remember, his idea is that Christianity, from its origins, was human-centered and drawing anthropocentric energies from the Hebrew Bible and the doctrines found there. The doctrine of the book of Genesis, for example, where in the first chapter of Genesis we're told to have dominion over the fish of the sea, birds of the air, and everything that creepeth on the face of the earth, and we are to subdue the earth. Well, okay, that's there, but in Genesis 2, there's a secondary creation account, and in that, the Hebrew authors and redactors are playing a word game too, and Adam, meaning Hebrew, human, man, is created, God lifts up earth, soil, breathes into it. Soil in Hebrew is Adamah. So the picture of the human in Genesis 2 is very different. It's a soil creature, an earthling. Genesis 1, the progression of the creation goes, God creates basically the ecosystems, the atmosphere that divides the seas from dry land. And then these ecosystem niches get filled in. The second acts in the Genesis 1 account are then God creates life in those three spheres. And then after creating the birds of the air, fish of the sea, etc., then, ta-da, God creates the human. So that, not surprisingly, has become a locus classicus that's been appropriated by generations of Jews, Christians, Muslims as well, to say, look at Genesis 1. The definitive creation account suggests that God creates and loves creation and says it's all good, but it's a buildup to the apex, which is the human, the apex of the pyramid of all of creation, so that the human is really in the top driver's seat. As God is to all humanity, so the human is to the rest of as God is to all of creation, so the human is to all of the world of physical creation. In that sense, there's a mirroring going on in the structure of Genesis 1 that puts humanity in a role of dominion. Oftentimes, that dominion ethic slid into a domination ethic, that God has created all of this for us, and so we, small humans with our short lifespans and our fragile and vulnerabilities, we need to dominate nature in its vastness as best we can. In earlier generations, a domination ethic isn't so bad when you don't have much technology to truly dominate and bash nature. Things shift when you keep the same ethic of domination and carry it through with the inertia into the 19th and 20th centuries. Once you couple an ethic of domination with the Industrial Revolution, then you've got a very different picture. The alternative historical account will note that there is a Genesis 1 and a Genesis 2. So it's not as clear as White paints it. Genesis 2 is relatively more creation-centered. First of all, Genesis 1, theologians would insist, it ain't so much a stress about humanity. It's theocentric. It's a God-centered document that it's all about drawing lines and what's the relevant line. Lynn White says the key line drawn in these texts is between the human and nature. Jewish rabbis, I think, and Christian theologians have strong disagreements. No, the key line drawn is between the Creator, the Godhead, and the rest of creation. That's the thick line. If that's the line you attend to first, then that puts humanity amidst the rest of creation. Now, you might want to say humanity has special capacities, yes, but humanity, if you draw the line between the Creator and the rest of creation, then humanity is clearly housed as a member in a broader community of creation. In the second alternative account that I'll be developing a little bit more, I think it's historically a lot more accurate not to find, as Lynn White does, the smoking gun in the origins of Christianity, but rather I would suggest what occurs, as Elizabeth Johnson, a fine scholar, puts it. Her argument is actually the history of Christianity is complex and it's balanced between both a relatively privileging of the human, but the frame of understanding the human condition was by and large a nature or creation frame. So the human was affirmed as a part and a member of the broader community of creation, one with special capacities and thus special privileges and also special needs. Those gave humans the rights to use animals and plants and chunks of the ecosystem. But there are also responsibilities built into this model as well. Elizabeth Johnson's argument is that by and large you can track a fairly balanced, or to the extent that Lynn White is right, that Christianity has historically affirmed a relatively human-centered ethic, you'd have to qualify that and say, and in the Hebraic period and the early Christian origins period, the patristic period, and the medieval period, at every step of the way, there were countervailing emphases on understanding the human in a position of humility as part of the broader order of creation. What happens is, I would argue, that's the rise of early modern science in Western Europe with its understanding of nature, its development of its authorization of a world picture of nature as a vast machine, a mechanistic world picture that impels Protestants, Christians, and many others to then understand, well, we're not machines, we have freedom and agency. So we're not part of the causal nexus that can be applied to understand the natural order of plants and animal life. And so it allowed a metaphysical dualism to occur where the Newtonian world picture then proved a real challenge to philosophical thinking. And Immanuel Kant writes his great philosophical system directly in response to the Newtonian notion of we can explain the ordering of nature in causal mechanistic terms. But that highlighted for Kant and others, that's right, that's the phenomenal world, but the noumenal world is the world in which also humans participate, the world of human freedom and rationality. And so once that metaphysical dualism got accepted, philosophical ethics and Christian theology pulled away, essentially ceding nature over to the Newtonians, basically accepting that you're right, it is a mechanistic universe, and guess what? This new, incredible, powerful science, they're the arbiters of the order of nature. Okay. Well, we can retain our historic authority by retreating into a distinctive sphere of philosophical ethics and theology will focus on the sphere of persons. Immanuel Kant emphasized you can divide the universe between two spheres. The sphere of things, the natural order, understood on mechanistic principles, and the sphere of persons. The sphere of persons are all rational agents, humans, are persons. And by virtue of our rationality, we're dubbed, as he put it, our ends in ourselves. We have human rights and special distinctive dignity. All other creatures, by virtue of not having rationality, and this is a question that our present generation will begin to rethink the assumption that animals lack any rationality whatsoever. But in Immanuel Kant's period, that assumption, by and large in Western Europe, was simply unquestioned by definition. So because he knows they run around, they're movable, they yelp, they can bite, they have lots of spheres of action. They just lack rationality. Therefore, he dubbed them as things. And so the operative descriptor for them was the sphere of things. Well, so we see how a metaphysical dualism leads to a huge ethical dualism of dual spheres, and the sphere of dignity and moral value gets restricted to rational humans. Everything else is classed as a thing. Well, that dualistic analysis, it seems to me, had a huge impact on modern Protestant and Christian thinking. Protestant thinking, when you think of what Martin Luther and others were focusing on, he was an Augustinian monk, obsessed with his own sinfulness and his inability to do enough to justify himself before God. So his saving line is feeling his justification not by works righteousness, but by the grace of God through Jesus Christ. So the motto of the Protestant Reformation, justification by grace through faith. Okay, he's painting a picture with key categories. What's the central drama of the Protestant Reformation in Luther's eyes? It's a sinner before God, all within the sphere of humans. So the central drama, and much of Protestant theology, focuses the theological spotlight on the interaction between persons, the great person God understood as using personal characteristics, and the lowly human person. And happily, there's a loving relationship here that saves the day. Nature is there. Some Protestant thinkers, Calvin, continued to emphasize the doctrine of creation. But clearly, the doctrine of creation and humanity's and God's relationship to the created order, under the intensification of the Reformation sensibilities about the importance of the centrality of Jesus Christ and God's grace and human sinfulness being overcome and justified. Clearly, the priority is focusing the spotlight of religious attention away from nature. The Catholic heritage continued to have a fairly robust emphasis on the doctrine of creation. As Christianity moved out of Israel into Greco-Roman culture, the early apostles collided with vastly powerful, sophisticated philosophical systems, Platonism, Neoplatonism, Aristotelianism. And there was a much synthesis work that occurred, and there was great respect for the power of these philosophical systems. And so much of early Christian, later became Catholic understanding, the medieval period understood sort of took Genesis and the doctrine of creation and used philosophical categories to explain it, and they developed a more philosophical understanding of creation as an emanation out of the Godhead, so that in God's greatness and love overflows into all the levels of being that we see around us. You've heard of the Great Chain of Being. The book by Arthur Lovejoy picks up the theme in both Christian and Western philosophical traditions of this vast drama of depicting how it's the one and the many. It's not just a Woody Allen joke, but it's how out of one, how do you get many? Is there a connection between snails and maple trees and the Godhead? And the notion of the Great Chain of Being is that out of the origins of the overflow of the magnificence of God's energy, all the material world is infused with the energy of God and held in existence in each moment. Now, there are two things that go on with a metaphor like chain of being. Many are suspicious of hierarchies, and to the extent that this is a chain dangling down from a transcendent zone, it easily allows early Christian theologians to do an ethical ranking that they pick up from Aristotle. Aristotle had the notion, and Thomas Aquinas drinks so heavily from the Aristotelian sources, but also the Neoplatonic sources. Aristotle said the existence of plants is to serve the interests of animals, and the existence of plants and animals together they're created for the sake of the human. So in this ranking that a great chain metaphor provides, you have a place for a highly human-centered ethical ranking that says, by and large, everything else has instrumental value solely as it serves the human. But there's another thing with a chain of being metaphor that some Catholic thinkers are beginning to look at. Namely, it's an emphasis on relationality and linkages. That for Lynn White, he would focus on how in early Catholic theology in the medieval period, clearly it's rationalist focused. Clearly, of course, Lynn White's right to the extent that it's human-centered, absolutely. Actually, the ethics is human-centered, but the frame of understanding is a nature frame. So the way of describing the human condition is one within the order of being. Contemporary philosophy doesn't like to talk that way. It sounds unprofessional, and we want to be postmodern, and so, order of being language or cosmology or even metaphysics in many contemporary philosophical discussions. All of this is dismissed as kind of arrogant and pretentious traditions of thought where little humans make mega claims about the grand scheme, and we know we can't. But they were unabashed in that period of trying to think about what is the grand scheme. I find interesting family resemblances once you begin to get ecologists focusing on, even Time magazine, the Global Warming Survival Guide with penguins. I guess it's a takeoff of Happy Feet. Environmentalists are begging us to look at the order of being, if not of the entire Milky Way, at least of this pretty remarkable planet that sustains us. And in that sense, if there's a metaphysical project, I think it is the practical metaphysical project that the environmental sciences are helping us to focus on. So my point about modern, emerging early and medieval Catholic theology was that it was a mixed bag. Yes, it's hierarchical and privileges the human, but at least it understood the proper frame for interpreting human life would be one within an order of nature. Now, to a great extent, Lynn White does have a particular point, and we can kind of chart steps along Christianity's path to losing an emphasis on the doctrine of creation and a focus on nature. I've mentioned the picking up of the Neoplatonic and Aristotelian hierarchy elements. Another element here was that the assumption in the 4th through 15th centuries that the order of nature is not really threatened, so it's not an ethical concern. The order of individual human lives is deeply threatened before penicillin, so that is where we put the lion's share of our ethical concern. So to emphasize the dignity of the human person wasn't a stupid thing to emphasize in those generations when human technology was so weak. I've mentioned the Protestant Reformation and its intensive spotlighting of the drama of salvation in the interaction between the human person and their God, with only secondary focus on the order of nature. But I really think it's the impact of the early modern mechanistic world picture that causes a huge retreat by Protestant and Catholic theology from making claims about humanity, for really caring much about humanity's or God's relationship to nature, and retreating into tightening theology to more toward a focus on humanity's relationship to other individual humans, so the ethical dimension, and also their relationship to God. But God understood on the sphere of persons side of the metaphysical dualism, that God understood as a transcendental supra person, the characteristics of God were all wisdom, all power, all agency, etc., a loving parent. So if if the notion of God is being configured on human-like characteristics, and humans are understood as fundamentally categorically separated from the natural order, then it's not surprising that the theology gets developed will be spotlighting humanity's relationship to other individual humans and humanity's relationship to God, and there'll be a division of labor that will occur where theology cedes nature over to the purview of science and feels okay about it because theology has already accepted that the notion that the sphere of nature isn't important ethically or religiously anyway. Now, I've talked a lot about the rise of the Newtonian world picture, but we've had other revolutions in science. Surely science has progressed far beyond Isaac Newton and what Francis Bacon did. And that's, of course, correct. But I would submit that nothing, well, what Einstein did was pretty important. It can blow us away if we spread enough nukes around the planet. But in the order of the life world, that in our day-to-day world, the dominant practices that you and I participate in of production and consumption, or driving around, or flying in airplanes, or watching TVs, these are not really the Einsteinian revolution has not really altered our dominant perceptions. That I would argue, in fact, the productive and consumption rhythms of the modern global economy and industrial production sustain many of the value assumptions of the Newtonian order. I can't sketch it all out, but I'll give you two little vignettes that display the historic reach and scope of the Newtonian mechanistic account. One can be found in a famous essay by William James, the Harvard philosopher. In 1910, you've probably heard of the essay, The Moral Equivalent of War. It's a great little essay. So 1910, he's watching the rise of very powerful weapons technologies coming along. He thinks we simply cannot afford to have war anymore. War is too horrific. But he felt that warfare maintained a healthy set of virtues. We can't afford the carnage, but the virtues of self-sacrifice and team effort and willingness to live a disciplined life, these are virtues that he wanted to sustain. He called them the manly virtues, the virtues of heroism. Sounds sexist to our ears, but put it back in that time period. And so he wanted a war equivalent without the carnage. What would be the equivalent, so the moral equivalent to war, he concluded what we need is a universal draft, that we can bring peace to the planet by drafting all the young people, all, say, college freshmen and sophomores, into an army enlisted against nature. Now, I'm not sure when the Panama Canal was dug, but isn't it being dug right around 1910? And so nature, the malarial swamps and the mosquitoes were killing people. The French had to retreat from their canal dig project because of that. So we're in the spirit of dominating nature and really feeling like we're struggling with the mosquitoes. And we need an army enlisted against nature that will sustain the pride and the confidence and elicit a new heroism in young people that will be enhanced as they join in what James calls the immemorial human warfare against nature. He thought this was going to be cool. So you could have peace, we can make war against nature, and it's going to be good. We'll have the manly virtues, and the lessons of self-sacrifice will be sustained to other generations. Now, what's interesting about his celebration in 1910 of a war against nature is, of course, the assumption that we can win a war against nature. First of all, that a war against nature might make sense. It depicts the human as the agent and nature as a passive field. Nature, in James's imagery, is going to take whatever we dish out for it. We now know, given the ecological sciences, in ways that James couldn't in 1910, that nature is not a passive realm, but rather it's a potently dynamic field of forces and systems of vast energy that react in complex and often destructive ways to human practices that disrupt ecosystems. In ways that James couldn't have imagined, we now know that a true war against nature will be really like a war in that there will be lots of non-human and human casualties. So in certain ways, James was more right than even he realized. Another vignette to capture the reach of the mechanistic world picture and its assumptions, John Rawls's magisterial work in ethics, A Theory of Justice. It's one of those big books. It's based on a contract model of thinking about justice between free agents. And so this is kind of the paradigm case for thinking about rights theory, and dignity is usually not even looking at all the possibilities of human relationships, not like parents to babies, for example, because babies aren't free agents yet. Babies are full of need, have little agency, none. Little. I don't want to get into arguments here, philosophical arguments. Very little agency. But Rawls, on page 512 of his tome, engages a set of questions that he hadn't dealt with at all. When he engages the questions of justice that are owed to animals or to nature, and he states that his theory would not suggest that we have strict duties that are owed to creatures who lack a sense of justice. So Rawls's argument in the social contract is a kind of argument based on symmetry. You owe responsibilities to other entities who have the capacities to feel they owe responsibilities back to you. So he thinks we don't have strict duties of justice that are owed to, say, primates or other mountain gorillas or dolphin or dogs or a maple tree. He states that his theory would not suggest that we have strict duties owed to such creatures, but yet he feels that we have moral obligations not to be cruel or to wipe out a whole species. He dubs the latter a great evil, while he holds that we have duties of compassion and humanity, Still, he believes that these issues lie outside of his theory of justice. Then he concludes, and I quote, "A correct conception of our relations to animals and to nature would seem to depend upon a theory of the natural order and our place in it. One of the tasks of metaphysics," that bad word again, "of metaphysics is to work out a view of the world which is suited for this purpose. How far justice as fairness," his view, "will have to be revised to fit into this larger theory is impossible to say." It's a really interesting thing Rawls is doing here. He's basically saying, I've written 500 pages, I'm tired, I feel some tension here, my theory, there's some anomalies here. I don't know what to do with justice to these creatures. I feel troubled, but I don't feel my contract theory can really fit. I guess in order to come up with an adequate response, we'd have to rethink a metaphysical system and then put my theory of justice inside a broader frame, but I'm tired and I'm not about to do it. So these illustrate between William James and John Rawls, they illustrate some of the sweep of the ethical impact of the mechanization of nature. Now, I want to just take a couple of minutes and sketch some of the mainstreams of Protestant Catholic theology in the 20th century. Oftentimes what's happening is the accounting for nature is being developed not primarily because of a concern to address animals and plants, but for example, in Protestant thinking, some Protestant theologians, in response to the rise of Hitler and fascism, some Protestant theologians sucked up to the fascist project, and they began to endorse categories of fatherland and blood and race and nature. And for Karl Barth and many others of the confessing church, the church that hated the Nazis, the category of nature inside Protestant theology became deeply tainted by its association with this suck-up project to fascism. So if that's what counts as an argument from nature, it's got to be blood and race and a legitimation of violence, then the category of nature becomes tainted for 30 years in progressive Protestant thinking, and it's taken off the table. You don't touch nature. It's too hot. And it usually endorses exclusionary and regressive violent attitudes. In the same period, existentialist thought is coming in and having a huge impact on Protestant and then Catholic theology in Western Europe. The emphasis in existentialism, if I remember Sartre from freshman year, let's see, there is no meaning but what we create. It's the lonely human, the maker of our own meaning. The world is absurd, the universe is absurd, and we find ourselves, as Heidegger said, thrown into this absurdness. But we don't despair, even though it gets lonely. We have to make our own meaning. And the categories there are the familiar one of the valorization of human freedom from Immanuel Kant's tradition, and an emphasis on the historical construction of reality and meaning, and the heroism that that generation faced as they had to face up to a Hitler. So there was a sense, a very dynamic sense of the dynamism of human history and the need to embrace that dynamism, and that human history and subjectivity become the key categories for thinking through theology. But what kind of history is it? Well, it's the history of humans. The geological history isn't the interest part. That's still caught up in the causal nexus of the mechanistic account. Nature, in fact, becomes the polar opposite of the category history in lots of philosophy and in theological circles. And what this allows is to build up the dynamism and celebrate the freedom of within history. History becomes valorized by Hegel as the sphere of freedom working itself out. What's nature? It's just a field of things that we use, human freedom takes in and transforms. Heidegger talks about how technology allows us not to see the forest, but to see potential plywood. It constructs a whole new way of setting upon, as Heidegger called it, of looking at the natural order through eyes shaped through a resource lens. What can we get from it? This has a huge impact not only on Protestant thinking, for whom the key locus of understanding the human is in the sphere of distinctive history, in which we are constructing the social construction of reality, see. Nature gets dropped as boring, so why not give it over to the purview of the scientists? They might be able to do something with it. We had no use for it. The Catholic thinking during this period, and I'll end with, do I have 10 more minutes? 5? 5 minutes. Okay. Gives me 5, we'll take 10. They always do. The camel's nose is under the tent. Catholic thinking, what's happening there? 20th century. The Catholic Church had long wedded itself to notions of a natural law, and the Protestant heritage hated that notion of a natural law as an intermediary buffer between the self and God. So the Protestant tradition tended to denigrate the traditions of the natural order and natural law as theologically quite secondary and often suspect. The Catholic tradition continued to affirm, following the magisterial theology of Thomas Aquinas, that in the 1890s gets officially labeled by Pope Leo XIII as the official theologian of the Catholic Church. Thomas Aquinas' understanding strongly emphasizes the order of creation. But in terms of natural law, among the debates that are beginning to hit the Catholic Church in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, where's the natural law analysis being applied? And it's only being applied primarily in papal reasoning to reaffirm the condemnation against birth control, that the use of condoms or the pill are seen in the papal reasoning of that encyclical Humanae Vitae as an unnatural impediment to the natural process of procreation. Hence, the use of birth control is impermissible. The other place prominently that natural law analysis has been played in Catholic thinking has been on the continued condemnation of homosexual relationships as described as unnatural acts. For many moderate and progressive Catholics and Catholic thinkers then, if this is what the natural law heritage cashes out in, there's been a walking away from that model of reasoning. The natural law seems to be only applied to sexual issues anyway, not in a thick way of saying not in the way the Stoics applied natural law reasoning to say human action must cohere with the grand order of the universe, but rather the modern Catholic papal reasoning has primarily fixated it primarily to sexual issues. The Catholic 20th century theology has been prominent in sort of getting tired of the order of creation and following the Protestant brothers and sisters with an emphasis on the special dignity of the human person. John Paul II had a long pontificate, 25 years or so. He had a PhD too, and some Catholic theologians worry when their popes have PhDs because religious community. Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Hindu, they're all facing the same challenges of global warming and ecosystem degradation. And they're trying to reach into their heritage of ideas and lift up both the historic obstacles to response We got to inventory religious traditions, inventory them for positive elements that can help empower a people to take on ecological responsibility, or also inventory what are the doctrines that function as obstacles to stepping up to ecological responsibility. I like the work of Thomas Berry. He's a Catholic priest. He argues that, the ecological sciences, along with evolutionary understandings of human life and the evolution of life on the planet, these are a new creation story that is a great gift that the scientific community is giving religious people around the world. What's the use of a good creation story? Well, historically, the mythic account of origins, that fundamental story sets the frame by which people interpret the meaning of themselves, their own dignity, how that dignity is related to others. In the Christian tradition, there's often a theological emphasis on humanity's uniqueness created in the imago Dei, the image of God. Well, I've actually dug through Thomas Aquinas. It was quite a strenuous piece of work. But it's interesting that Catholic theologians sort of stop talking there, but they don't notice that even Thomas Aquinas says, and oh, by the way, all other entities, all other living entities, by virtue of being created, are also created in the likeness of God. Now, if pressed, I can't dig into the Latin and whip out what's the likeness and what's the imago. I know the imago, but it's a different term. But Thomas Aquinas in that is doing something complex. He's saying, yeah, humanity has a privileged dignity in being especially like God. But oh, by the way, let's not grasp this monopoly too tightly, because God was gracious enough to fling this relationship to the material world as broadly across as all living entities. So there are elements, even in medieval sources, that are not anachronistic. They can be employed to reframe things. The notion of the modern ecological evolutionary world picture as a new creation story, Berry insists it's actually better than the Genesis account. One, the Genesis account was a sectarian account. It had no empirical backing. But we have an international community of scientists, not just Western, European, and American scientists, but Indian and Chinese and Japanese and Indonesian scientists too, all generally agreeing on the grand consensus of the ancient evolution of life on the planet. It's a story of origins. It also, just the way Darwin did, it places the human as a primate, a very special primate, but an animal. Aristotle called us the rational animal. For too long, Protestant and Catholic theology have taken half of Aristotle's phrase and glommed onto the rationality and lifted that up as a flag to emphasize our distinctiveness. But it's time to recover through Darwin, through the modern ecological account of creation, our animality too. And that means our membership in the broader community of life. That's what Aldo Leopold is doing when he depicts us as part of the land community. So there are lots of elements and lots of wrestling that I've given you a snapshot of the way Christian theology is buffeted by different claims and different assumptions. And my suggestion is it's really modern Christian theology that pulls away from nature, and that we can recover much of the richness of the heritage of that's more creation-centered heritage and do it critically. And that can be a real resource for the 2 billion Christians on the planet to try to step up to environmental responsibility. The Hindus will have their own special way of appropriating their heritage, as well as the Muslims and the Jewish people. Thank you very much. I've talked too much. Let's, questions or comments? Thank you. Thank you.
Just mention that people need to go to the microphone. I can do that. Yeah. We'll have a period of questions. We've been asked to step up to the microphone, please, so that the questions can be recorded. We'll have a period of questions. I have no idea how long it'll last.
Thanks. Hello, yes.
Thank you for the overview and the analysis. A couple of comments, and one of them kind of climaxes in a question. One is your historical analysis, with which I completely agree about the predominance of a mechanistic worldview, but it's important, I think, to bring a little nuance to that in terms of Newton himself was not a thoroughgoing mechanist. That's why he engaged in alchemy, because he thought that would be the connection between God and the mechanical level. But what happened over time was a reductionistic view of science, in which we still have in people like Richard Dawkins, E.O. Wilson, and so forth, who believe that all of these higher level realities, including human beings, can be reduced to the operations of a gene pool, or even lower levels. It seems to me that, and I am a lover of science, but nevertheless, it seems to me there have been a lot of negative fallout of science with regard to how we view nature as a whole. And that's related to, I think, a cultural fact that I must confess bothers me deeply. Whenever we, in the modern Western world, whenever we think about nature, we have what I call the cult of the expert. We have to turn to the scientist to tell us what nature is about, instead of encouraging people to think about nature independently of what they learn about science. In fact, we can't even think of bona fide knowledge unless it is somehow have the imprimatur of a scientific community. Right? Now, that has tended, whether intentionally or not, that has had the larger effect of banning questions of the sense of nature. Because nature is viewed passively, because it's viewed as a thing that is these irrational, or these forces that may be rational in the sense that we can analyze them. But for people to look at nature and to say, there's a meaning there, there's a sense there, there's a purpose there, that's what's largely been lost in the West, I think. It has not been lost in Eastern Christian thinking, for example, in the Byzantine tradition. And it wasn't really, as I think you rightly pointed out, it wasn't lost in the medieval and ancient Christian views, but with the advent of the complexities of the Enlightenment, Christianity that was more secularized, all of these developments sort of coalesced into a view of nature that alienates it from humanity. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Erazim Kohak.
Yes.
Okay. The Embers and the Stars, you've read that book?
Yeah.
That book for me was revolutionary in that it shook me out of my dogmatic slumber as a Western person. And it made me ask the question, when I look at nature, is it possible that there is a moral sense of nature? Is there a moral sense of nature?
Great, thank you. It's very nice to get such easy and I agree with you fully that much of Newton's work also includes lots of prayers too. And for a long time there was a historic sort of the notion was, well, he was a modern scientist and he's trying to cover his backside with the prayer language stuff. And then sort of the historic revisionists now are saying, no, he's probably more complex. A lot of the early scientists were sons of Protestant pastors. And Francis Bacon felt that the new technology would allow us to repair the mastery that we had over nature, the easy mastery over nature that we enjoyed in Eden, but we were lost with the rupture of the sin of Adam. And so technology would let us become the new Adam with an easy, effortless kind of control over nature. Yeah, Kohak's book is marvelous. I'm wondering, I think your point about expert knowledge is a tremendously important one, but it doesn't just impact on, we have the complexity of the rise of modern university life and reward structures for distinct lexicons of specialization. So many people are scared to talk about their religious feelings because the expert PhDs in theology might laugh at them for their not using the proper terminology. So it doesn't just impact on people being scared to feel nature. It's people are scared that I'm an amateur in this area and I'll be shown up and embarrassed by the specialist. So I don't have a lot of deep thoughts to respond particularly. It is interesting to think through where's the physical and kind of social location of theological production occurring in, so the institutional life of where are the theologians living, who are theologians down through the centuries. And there was a period in the, I don't know, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 12th centuries, by and large it was monastic enterprise. And the monasteries are located away from urban centers in the midst of fields and forests, and often the Benedictines would take fairly remote areas, partly keep the monks away from the temptations of the city and women and all of that sort of thing. So, but they're in a rural setting, and they're done by, it's in an agrarian rhythm of life that's the social location for Christian theology. In the 12th, 13th, 14th century, by and large, it moves to great universities rising up in modern Europe. So Thomas Aquinas is teaching at the University of Paris. Now, it's you got to be credentialed, you got to have a PhD. And the reward structure is right in a professionalized jargon for your peer group. So I think it impacts on lots of disciplines, and C.P. Snow in the Two Cultures analysis has a very important finger on something that is not just a gap between the kind of culture and understanding and passions of scientists and humanities people. It's, we don't even know what each other does anymore. And so that allows a kind of separation out. And I think that Two Cultures analysis, well, at Loyola University, where I teach, it's assumed that the theology department has to be a humanities. So we locate it in the humanities building. Well, that makes sense, of course. But wait a second, if the doctrine of creation, what it does, it pulls the social and physical location of the theologians and the theology students away from the natural order and away from hanging around the snack shop where the geologists and physicists. So the sets of questions that count as really important are going to be textual questions like what the other humanities have. But their understanding of reality will be, of course, it's all socially constructed. Whereas scientists will have a very different view. Thank you. Excellent. Kohak's book is marvelous. I think of the night sky differently after him, too. Other questions or comments or arguments? Polite arguments are not welcomed, but as long as they're polite, they're allowed. Hello?
One of the responses to Lynn White, I think, was a Chinese geographer. I don't recall his name. Bruce, do you remember his name? No. Well, I could maybe say repeat or summarize what he said, but he basically said that, or pointed out that there's lots of environmental degradation in China. And you can look around the world today and you see places in any culture that are adopting the Western consumption style. So is it really what we have our religious beliefs, or is it, if you give people an opportunity to live an easier life and having some ecological damage at the same time, they'll opt to live an easier life.
Excellent point. I think you put your finger on one of the biggest critiques of white. White basically has a monocausal chain of impact that says religions are really important, and they shaped the origin of modern science, and that shapes the takeoff of technology, and that's causing the damage to ecological issues. By my revisionist interpretation, it's not so much theology's in the driver's seat. I'm suggesting that, in fact, it was the rise of modern science that massively impacted theology. White suggests it's the religious doctrinal understanding that shapes society, and even to the point of scientific takeoff. I would agree with that Chinese fellow that let's be a little more humble maybe. I think religious people kind of liked some of White's argument because he stressed the importance of religion as a muscular shaper. But in my analysis, I'm actually trying to say I'll go halfway with White and say religion is a shaper of society, but religion is also being simultaneously shaped on by different historic periods, such as if the rise of Nazism impacts really heavily on pushing Protestant theology to be configured in a certain way, that's important data for us to understand. So it's at least a two-way street of interchange back and forth between religious systems and historic practices, whether they're scientific or economic practices. To buttress your point, my wife, as I said, does a lot of, in Hindu studies and does a lot of her work in Benares. And after Lynn White, many Christians sort of said, Lynn White's right. The problem is too much anthropocentrism. What we need to do is recover the notion of the sacrality of nature that the pagan traditions and animist traditions and indigenous peoples have and the Asian peoples have. Well, the Ganges River is a goddess. It doesn't get any more sacred than that. And the Ganges River, the Ganga, is also one of the most polluted rivers on the planet. So what you find, so ecologists sort of come in thinking, well, wait a minute, if the river's sacred, a sacred goddess, then surely there should be behavioral sanctions against polluting. But see, it's much more complicated than that. If ecologists come to priests along the banks in Benares, along the river, and say, oh, poor Mother Ganga is being polluted, we need to help her. They say, you have it theologically wrong. Mother Ganga, in her sacredness, is all-powerful. It's not she who needs our help. We need her help. Her power as a goddess is able to handle any pollutant. So actually, here's an example of this, the thing that Westerners are looking for, a thicker understanding of the sacrality of nature. They've got it, and it, in and of itself, in fact, undercuts an ethical justification for environmental protection. Now, interesting Hindu leaders are lifting up themes in Hinduism to try to make the case that it's simply unsupportable to denigrate a sacred entity like Mother Ganga, and therefore we need to join with her in partnership. So they're doing a revisionist Hindu theology responding to ecological threats. Thank you, that was an excellent point.
May I ask something?
Please,
Without mic.
off the record.
Well, I mean, I came a bit late, so I'm commenting on the second part. I think I was very interested in general with what you catches. But I wonder, I mean, what I hear kind of listening from a Buddhist perspective, which you haven't mentioned, from a Buddhist perspective, one feels that one question kind of remains skirted, namely that, I mean, we kind of continuously re-establish this pattern of, well, our agency versus nature. I mean, we do not so much think of ourselves as being nature, I mean, as much as anything else. Our term nature seems to have kind of shed some of its ancient implications, right? I mean, we have this notion of nature as both natura naturans and natura naturata. And my understanding is that we have very much kind of fallen in with this perhaps partly biblical-based implication that since we are the image of God, we are kind of entitled to a special position, and this entitlement would in fact, and there are other passages obviously supporting that, would entitle us to kind of, well, play the role of masters.
Yeah.
That we are the gods here. I mean, not the animals, not the plants, nothing, we are the gods. And I wonder whether, I mean, Rawls and all these other guys aside, but I wonder whether we can really come to a clear sense of, I mean, us being really part of a continuum without reconsidering how we could reappropriate this dimension of natura naturans. That is, I mean, we are, as much as we are agents and in that sense culpable, but we are at the same time not just the agents we kind of love to consider ourselves.
Excellent point. The Buddhist tradition has resources for some of these questions, and that if I understood the question, it's getting at the dangers in emphasizing, in having our model of the human, overemphasizing human agency, even agency in responding to environmental concerns, that stress sometimes leads us to fail to pay sufficient attention to how we are part of nature itself. Is that at all like?
What I'm really suggesting is that we are arrogating the position of God.
Yeah.
I mean, we are working on this premise that there is a creator and a created, kind of agent and inactive, or subject and objectivity.
Right.
And the replication, the continuous repetition of that pattern would lead to a situation that there is really no God. And I mean, an understanding of or thinking through of the totality and continuity of the sacrality of nature seems to be quite impossible on the basis of that.
Right. It's a concern about arrogance, and maybe it would be very difficult for Protestant and Catholic theology with theistic traditions that have a God model. A perennial danger will be the usurpation of the notion of godlike capacities of the human. It seems to me that's why the evolutionary world picture is so important, that Christians and Jews and Muslims may want to keep theistic notions, but it will be deeply humbling to remember if there is a God, we now know it wasn't a snap of the fingers across 7 days, that an adequate concept in the West of God now must appropriate that God truly creates and sustains across the millennium through the evolutionary forces. So that retains a God concept, but it also thickly puts us in the midst of evolutionary origins, and that flags our animality. And so that should be a humbling check against the arrogance. One thing, I can only connect to your concern with a certain baggage that I have. There's a real debate in Christian ecological circles about the category of stewardship, that in the response to Lynn White, it was said, oh yeah, Lynn White's right, we shouldn't be anthropocentric, we're called to be stewards of nature. And yet others say, wait a minute, that's still a position of arrogance, that stresses human agency. And a number of smart people who I respect say, ooh, even the stewardship model, it still asserts our distinctiveness and puts us in a hierarchical position vis-a-vis the rest of nature. Well, I think I'm now, despite thinking that there's certainly something to be said for the dangers of arrogance, but that in fact, human numbers and human power are empirically distinctive today. And we are, in fact, historically, I would argue, in a position of dominance. And we've been misusing that dominance. But the first remedy to the disease is to name the position of dominance that we're in. Remember a couple years ago when we had the ANWR, Alaskan National Wildlife Refuge, and there was all this concern about oil drilling, and that might mess up the pristineness of the tundra? It won't matter if global warming comes along. You can build fences around any ecosystem, but the species that live there have evolved into that niche. They're dependent upon the climate conditions and the weather conditions. So you could keep an area perfectly pristine, but as fossil fuel consumption ups the carbon dioxide atmospheric parts per million, you're not going to have any pristine ecosystems. And as humanity, look at the trajectory of humanity's rise, 1.6 billion, 10 years before my mother was born. All right, 1900, it was 1.6 billion. We quadrupled humanity up to 6 billion by 2000. And in about 43 years, we're probably going to have 9 billion. So in that sense, I think it's not an issue of, it's sort of two issues. One is the ethics of mastery, or the term mastery, we're in a dominant position. Descriptively, we are. That means the ethical issue is using our dominant position as wisely as we can to restrain humanity's numbers and our arrogant trotting of the ecosystems of the planet. We now usurp, what's physicists in here, net primary product? We usurp, that's terrestrial net primary. No, that's global. No, you're right, that's terrestrial, sorry. You get a doubling of human population and an economic rise, you're going to be usurping 80% of net primary product. What's left to sustain the other plant and animal species? So you've got your finger on a key issue, and it's arrogance, and the key issue is only getting more compelling, and we are, I think, in a dominant position.
Are we controlled? Does dominance mean controlled?
No, gosh, no. The arms race, the fact that the Soviet Union and the United States had massive nuclear arsenals didn't mean we were controlling the tempo of things. The arms race itself has an independent tempo. I don't think anybody's controlling the economic juggernaut. Every government is vulnerable to the electorate who demands increased economic growth. It can be Democratic or Republican administrations, and it can impact kings and democratically elected governments. Every rickshawwala in India dreams of the day he can have an auto rickshaw. I dream of the day my chairperson recognizes my brilliance and gives me a raise. There are forces that have been unleashed, and they're vast. They make up a global economic surge on a limited planet.
Do you want to take another question? Or
Sure. I don't want to overstay my welcome.
Final question then, if I may. I would like to ask you how we would be conducting ourselves. I mean, you're suggesting this alternative, a Thomas Berry-inspired combination of an evolutionary understanding of ourselves with monotheism. But what will actually the implications be? I mean, on the one hand, you could say, well, it means we're not going to be as destructive as we have been in the past. So you could say, well, we're just going to behave ourselves better. But, you know, is there a sort of a quick sketch of the value system that's involved here? For example, would it sometimes be okay from this perspective to allow a human being to die to save the non-human? You know, if we dethrone human beings, they no longer are the sole centers of dignity. Could you spell out a bit the kind of picture, the sort of value hierarchy maybe that would emerge? Yeah.
Sure, I'll take two steps. I'll delay the direct question. One impact here, I went to a conference at University of Notre Dame after President Bush defeated John Kerry. And the people in the room were by and large Catholic theologians interested in ecological issues. And we were angry. And we were angry at a couple of American Catholic bishops who held a press conference during the campaign, and they said, the Catholic moral issue is abortion, and John Kerry's pro-choice and George Bush is pro-life. Therefore, a vote for John Kerry is a complicity with evil. And that's okay for American Catholic bishops to do that. That's sort of part of the church teaching thing. But we were very angry because I actually teach another document that the American Catholic bishops have, a pastoral letter on global climate change and concerns for that. It's a Jim Dandy document. It just doesn't get read anywhere. It just isn't promulgated anywhere. It's in every Catholic library, but nobody reads it because nobody's heard about it. And we were angry because not one American Catholic bishop stood up and held another press conference and said something like, you know, my brothers in Christ have noted the concern of abortion, and that's a Catholic concern. But by the way, global warming is a Catholic moral issue of concern too. So some of it is just, in the short term, it's not just the theoretical value priorities or topic priorities that a membership or a community, be it the Catholic Church or the Methodist Church or the United States community, flags as important, of primary importance. It's how that excludes discussion and recognition of the importance of other issues. So just to get that editing readjusted so that some issues, environmental issues, have been off the table in Catholic hierarchical concerns, essentially, for a long, long time. So that would be a tangible thing that one would hope. How to address the issue of value hierarchy. Deep ecologists, Nace and others have argued for biospherical egalitarianism to argue that each and every living entity, human, animal, and plant, has equal intrinsic value. And I didn't buy the argument, and so I got interested in the argument. I dug really deeply, and my conclusion, and I might be wrong, is they announced this sweeping principle of equality up front, but in the back door, there's a value ranking that's allowed. For example, Nace, he's a Norwegian father of deep ecology. He's a wonderful guy. And so he's emphasizes biospherical egalitarianism, but then in another chapter, he's emphasizing, isn't it wonderful the way the Native American Indians on the plains would hunt buffalo? And he didn't have any problem with hunting and killing of animals pushed by human need. And that seemed a little odd to me because he's saying, then he says, it's okay for that Indian to kill the buffalo because they really need the buffalo, but he doesn't want there to be a philosophical justification based on any assessment of higher intrinsic value that the Indian has over the buffalo. And I sort of really didn't begin to buy it then. And so it seems to me that you always sneak in ranking. To make a decision, you have to have some prioritization scheme to focus the decision point. But, yeah. Doesn't our healthcare system err often in trying to keep people who are in the very last stages of their life unnecessarily alive? My doctoral dissertation advisor wrote an essay. This will be televised. He got pissed off that the doctors were trying to keep his mother alive far beyond what he and the family considered would be justifiable. So the issue, you don't want to throw away traditional notions of human dignity. What you want to do is extend and expand and talk about primate dignity and animal dignity, and not snicker when their notion of animal rights. What are rights anyway? I mean, rights is a philosophical tradition that's used to flag special intrinsic value. But most of us would agree against Immanuel Kant that dogs and cats and mountain gorillas do have intrinsic value. In a forced choice dilemma, we might want to save our grandmother over the mountain gorilla. But we shouldn't have our ecological ethics driven by arbitrary forced choice dilemmas. Most of the time, much of our ecological reasoning can be, it's not contests necessarily between this life and that life. Often it's more likely contests between this type of life who wants to live a lifestyle of really overconsumption and squeezing out the ecosystem supports of other species. Baird Caldecott argues that rarity, and so members of a species that's endangered, those lives really are carriers of distinctive value more than members of species who have gazillions of members. I can't give you a good casuistry other than it's has to be case by case, and I would worry the anti-ecological movements often depict ecological concern as somehow anti-human, just the way they picked up the spotted owl case and said, look, see what those wacko environmentalists are doing. They care more about the spotted owl than jobs and human communities. But that's only because the Olympic Peninsula and the state of Washington hadn't helped to diversify the economy in those areas. They're creative things that can be done to avoid, that can be win-win situations.
Could interrupt you? Would you mind to step over to the microphone because it's being recorded? Thanks.
Sorry, could you just sketch out quickly? So when you're talking about extending the intrinsic value to animals and perhaps even farther, do you still see that being located principally at the individual level, or is there an intrinsic value for assemblages or natural systems, or can you kind of just speak to that briefly, that extension?
Sure. I think Thomas Reagan is one of the most prominent animal rights theorists, and he thinks assemblages like species are not real, and that it doesn't make sense in his understanding to speak of the intrinsic value of a species, that what you have are individual caribou, and they have capacities of suffering and some agency. And it makes sense to speak of the intrinsic value of individual caribou. I think there's real danger in the environmental philosophical theory being too quick to say only my way or the highway. And often even throwing away anthropocentric value traditions too, that to a great extent environmental ethicists often spit on traditions of anthropocentric or human-centered analyses. And I try to remind people, you know, it might be good in a philosophy class, but when it comes to the corridors of Washington, D.C., what's going to get environmental protection legislation through are usually anthropocentric arguments. So it seems to me, I don't like the way Tom Reagan draws it down and says only individuals are the sort of entities that can carry intrinsic value. That raises other questions. What is this intrinsic value? I had a professor who said humans have rights, but not the way they have elbows and feet. So that's a reminder that rights and intrinsic value are ways of speaking. We ascribe intrinsic value. It's a way of describing and labeling for a purpose to flag what we take as important. So I like Lawrence Johnson's approach, A Morally Deep World, I think his book was called. To me, it's best book out there. Well, it's the last book in that really tight area that I've been reading, so undoubtedly there are more recent excellent books. But he argues against Reagan, look, let's have a holistic ethic. The animal welfare and animal liberation and animal rights approach of Singer or Reagan, why do they think it's not important to talk about broader ecosystems and the value of plant life? You're not going to have many animals unless you can secure the ecosystems that provide the carrying capacity for the precious animals that Singer and Reagan like. And so Lawrence Johnson, I think, has a more holistic approach to ecological ethics that would say, yeah, when we're talking about human value and human dignity, there's a certain lexicon and a certain set of concerns. Animal welfare, it's a perfectly legitimate set of questions about animal rights, the intrinsic value of an individual animal. But the intrinsic value of plants and ecosystems are not negligible, silly issues either. And so I do prefer the broader frame that an Aldo Leopold or that a Lawrence Johnson or really ecological ethics provides, because the animal rights and animal liberation approach hasn't made an ecological turn yet. They're a triangular affair. They join with ecological ethics in breaking the wall of anthropocentrism, and that's good. But in a lot of ways, if you only focus on the value of individual members, you're extremely far away from the core insights of the ecological sciences, which are holistic and relationally oriented.